fundamentally played a significant role in getting these things going. And I thank Christos and I thank also Maria Rodoto, who from the first day were supportive of what was going on. And back then, actually, for the first year, the seminars were called the Latrobe and Greek Community History and Culture Seminars. That changed somewhere down the track. Of course, from our side, my brother Kostas Markos, Bill Papasteriadis, and myself played an important role in the beginning of this. And of course, we have to acknowledge probably the father of these seminars, Kyriako Manatidi. Kyriako Manatidi was probably the first person that suggested that we start talking, we start creating this forum where ideas can be discussed, looking at ancient Greek civilization, but also discussing about what's happening here today and discussing Greek Australian history. And I don't know where Kyriako is now. I hope he is well. I'm sure he is. But thank you very, very much, Kyriako Manatidi, for being an intrinsic member of that initial group. And you did a great job back then. And I looked at the list of about 100 people, even as early as March 2011. And if I remember well, it was in March 2011, 17th of March, that we had our initial cocktail party where we basically got the ball rolling. We had about 100 people interested. And since then, we've been having a constant, steady participation of about 50 to 100 people at every lecture. Tonight, we don't have as many people, but of course, that's got to do with the fact that COVID is still affecting a lot of people. We've had a lot of apologies, but then again, also people have chosen another way of attending or observing, watching these lectures, and that's via Zoom. And Kostas here tells me that we've got quite a few people both on YouTube, Facebook, and on Zoom. And I thank all those people very, very much for participating. That is fantastic. As I said before, I looked at the old list of interested students. I think that's what we call them, first students of the seminars. And amongst that list, I saw two names that stood out. And they were the names of Rosalia Nicolaou and Dora Kostadinidis. These are two young women that were members of our committee in the early years, that were very supportive of the seminars. They attended, from what I remember, most of the seminars back then, but unfortunately, they're no longer with us. So I pay tribute to both Rosalia Nicolaou and Dora Kostadinidi. And I also like to thank those people that have stayed with us over the past 10 years and who have really helped in continuing our role here at the community and making sure that these seminars are a success. And it's really a small group of people, but it's a group of people that believe in what they're doing. They understand that the community is more than just a building. It's not a building, it's the people that are here tonight. And those people, in a way, have created an atmosphere, a sense of belonging, and that's very, very important because now we've become a part of a family here, the seminars family. It's amazing the friendships that have been created over the past 10 years. And the discussions, sometimes they're lively discussions, sometimes they're not as lively, sometimes we disagree, sometimes we agree, but that's what democracy is about. That's why we have these seminars. They initiate discussion, and in most cases we continue it later on. So can I say thank you to Chrysoula Stamopoulou? Can I say thank you to Lena and Anthea Giannakopoulos, who are not here, who are not with us tonight because of some issue that they unfortunately weren't able to come. Can I say thank you to also to Dimitra Lagoudaki, who have been committee members since day one. Thank you very, very much to those people there. And also a special thanks, no, I haven't forgotten Nick, to Nick Dallas. Nick Dallas joined our team early in 2012, and since then, he's been the heart and soul of this organisation. If it wasn't for Nick Dallas, I don't think that the bar would have the bar has been risen very, very high, and that's all to do with Nick Dallas. Thank you very, very much, Nick. I'm proud to call him a friend and a fellow traveller. And he tells me that he's got an incredible program lined up for this year. I've already seen it. It's a program that's it's loosely based on the 200 years and the revolution of 1821. And we're hoping to have a printed leaflet pretty soon. Is that right, Nick? Maybe next week when our next function takes place. I also like to thank those people behind the scenes, the people that work at the community. Gustav Luniti, who is, if it wasn't for him, with his technical support, we wouldn't be able to have these online presentations. Thank you very, very much, Costa. Thank you to George Menidis, who also plays a significant role in helping out constantly. To Stacey, who's our financial person here, but it also shows a lot of interest in what's going on. To Kostas Markus, the secretary of the organisation that's always here to help us. And also to Stavros, who's our administrator and helps out and answers everybody's queries. So thank you very, very much to all those people. I think I've said enough. From little things, big things grow. And that's what's happened here. And as my friend Nick Dallas says, build it and they shall come. Well, I think they will come this year too, Nick. That's enough for me. Thank you very, very much tonight for attending tonight's hybrid presentation. Yasu Vrasida, I want to introduce you. Nico Dalla will do a much better job in introducing you. I have the pleasure of introducing the Consul General, the newly arrived Consul General of Greece, Mr. Emmanuel Kakavallakis, μπερδεύω τα κριτικά ονόματα. Να τον καλωσορίσουμε στη Μελβούρνη. Είχαμε μια σύντομη συζήτηση και ο κύριος Κακαβαλάκης μας είπε πως δεν έχει σταματήσει από την ημέρα της άφηξής του. Αυτή είναι η Μελβούρνη, κύριε Κακαβαλάκη. Τώρα αρχίστε, έχετε δηλαδή 3 χρόνια στο τρέξιμο. Σας προειδοποιώ, να είστε καλά, φαίνεστε γερός, δυνατός, αθλητικός τύπος. Κάποιος φίλος έτσι μου είπε και θα χρειαστείτε να είστε αθλητικός τύπος εδώ στη Μελβούρνη γιατί θα τρέχετε. Welcome to Melbourne, and without further ado, please welcome the Consul General of Greece here in Melbourne, Mr. Emmanuel Kakavallakis.
Θα μου επιτρέψετε να μιλήσω ελληνικά. Καλησπέρα σε όλους. Να αρχίσω δίνοντας συγχαρητήρια στην κοινότητά μας και σε όλους που εργάζονται για να πραγματοποιούνται αυτές οι εκδηλώσεις. Είναι πραγματικά μια πηγή φωτός σε αυτή την πόλη. Η φετινή χρονιά με τις εκδηλώσεις της δίνει την ευκαιρία να πούμε πολλά πράγματα και να βρεθούμε πολλές φορές και ελπίζω ότι θα είναι όλο και περισσότεροι παρόντες είτε ζωντανά είτε διαδικτυακά για να μπορούμε να συναντηθούμε και να συνομιλήσουμε. Απόψε έχουμε ένα καταπληκτικό θέμα. Την καλησπέρα μου στον καθηγητή μας, τον κύριο Καραλή, από τον οποίο περιμένουμε να ακούσουμε πολλά και ενδιαφέροντα. Το 1821, όπως λέει ο Στέφανος Καβαλιεράκης σε ένα βιβλίο του, μοιάζει ακόμα και σήμερα σε ένας πίνακας ζωγραφικής με τόσο πολλά χρώματα που φαίνεται δύσκολο στο μάτι να εστιάσει σε ένα από αυτά. Ενώ αν τον παρατηρήσει κάποιος προσεκτικά, προσφέρει πολλές διαφορετικές επιλογές να ασχοληθεί. Είναι ένα θέμα το οποίο επιδέχεται πολλές ερμηνείες. Να σημειώσουμε ότι από την άλωση και μετά καταγράφονται πάνω από 60 εξεγέρσεις στον ελλαδικό χώρο, οι περισσότερες τοπικές, αλλά εξεγέρσεις. Στην πατρίδα μου την Κρήτη έχουμε κατά μέσο όρο μια επανάσταση κάθε 1,5 χρόνο. Φυσικά, για αυτές τις εξεγέρσεις και τις επαναστάσεις υπάρχουν αίτια, αναγόμενα στην κατάκτηση, την καταπίεση και την υποδούλωση. Για κάποιους φαίνεται πως όχι. Ίσως πρόκειται για ένα πολεμικό σπορ των Ελλήνων. Η Επανάσταση, επειδή επέτυχε, απέκτησε πολλούς επίδοξους πατέρες. Όπως ξέρετε, η ήττα είναι πάντοτε ορφανή, ενώ η νίκη διεκδικείται από πολλούς. Παρουσιάστηκαν ήδη από την αρχή της Επανάστασης πολλά ερμηνευτικά σχήματα. Θα το πω συνοπτικά, η μία πλευρά, η παραδοσιακή, που εκφράζεται κυρίως από τον Φιλίμωνα, μιλάει για μια επανάσταση, μια εθνική πανηγενεσία, ενώ η άλλη πλευρά εντάσσει το σχήμα στην νεωτερικότητα και τη θεωρεί ένα παρακολούθημα της Γαλλικής Επαναστάσεως. Ήρθε κάπου εκεί ως μέγας ισορροπιστής ο Παπαϊγόπουλος, ο οποίος ενοποίησε, αν θέλετε, τις δύο ερμηνείες και μίλησε για μια εθνική χριστιανική επανάσταση και ήταν μια ερμηνεία η οποία μας συνόδευσε για έναν αιώνα χωρίς πολλά προβλήματα. Στις αρχές του 20ου αιώνα όμως εμφανίζονται καινούργιες ερμηνείες με πρώτα τον Κοδράτο και στη συνέχεια τον Δημαρά, οι οποίες εντάσσουν την ελληνική επανάσταση στο πλαίσιο των ευρωπαϊκών επαναστάσεων, δίνουν οικονομιστικά, αν θέλετε, κριτήρια, συνεπεί με έναν ίσως κακοχωνεμένο μαρξισμό της εποχής. Να πούμε ότι το σχήμα αυτό, η σύνδεση εμπορίου και νεοελληνικού διαφωτισμού με την Επανάσταση είναι ένα σχήμα που δεν υπήρχε πριν. Ούτε ο Σάθας, ούτε ο Ζακυνθινός, ούτε ο Άμαντος έκαναν τέτοιου είδους απόλυτες συνδέσεις. Από την άλλη, σπανίως συναντάμε εκπρόσωπο του νεοελληνικού διαφωτισμού, ο οποίος αποτελείται, παράδοξο, κυρίως από κληρικούς, στην επαναστατική διαδικασία, με την εξαίρεση του Ρίγα Φεραίου και μέρη του Άνθιμου Γαζή. Σπάνια επίσης στην επαναστατική διαδικασία θα δούμε κάποιον έμπορο, πλην 2-3 γνωστών περιπτώσεων, ο οποίος θα συμμετέχει στη διαδικασία, η οποία ανήκει στη φιλική εταιρεία, μέλη της οποίας είναι κυρίως στρατιωτικοί, κληρικοί και κοτσαμπάσιδες. Σύμφωνα με τις πηγές, μάλιστα, οι έμποροι, ειδικά οι έμποροι στη Δυτική Ευρώπη, εκφράζονται με μεγάλη ανησυχία για την Επανάσταση, γιατί ζουν και δρούν σε μια οργανωμένη και σταθερή δυτική αγορά και άρα έχουν περισσότερους λόγους να ανησυχούν παρά να επιχαίρουν. Ο Έλληνας έμπορος, δηλαδή, όπως φαίνεται, δεν μπαίνει στην επαναστατική πορεία ως έμπορος, αλλά ως ενεργό μέλος μιας παραδοσιακής εθνικής κοινότητας, η οποία εκφράζει μια κοινή εμπειρία γλώσσας και θρησκείας, μέσα δηλαδή σε μια αίσθηση πολιτισμικής και εθνικής διαφοράς και όχι στα πλαίσια της εμπορικής λογικής. Δεν θα επεκταθώ πολύ, γιατί όλα αυτά τα συναρπαστικά φαντάζομαι θα μας τα διηγηθεί ο καθηγητής, ο κύριος Καραλής. Θα ήθελα μόνο έτσι, εν είδη πειράγματος, να θέσω μερικά ερωτήματα. Για παράδειγμα, γιατί η Ελληνική Επανάσταση εκδηλώνεται πρώτη και με διαφορά 30-50 ετών από όλες εκείνες των χριστιανικών χωρών της λιπής Βαλκανικής? Ποιο είναι το ιδιαίτερο βάρος της Ελληνικής Επανάστασης όσον αφορά τη διάρρηξη του αντιδραστικού ιστού της Ιεράς Συμμαχίας? Ποια είναι η ακριβής έννοια της φράσης «για του Χριστού την πίστη, την Αγία και της πατρίδος την ελευθερία»? Και πώς στη βάση αυτή καθορίζεται η σχέση του εθνικού με το θρησκευτικό? Πώς σχετίζεται το λεγόμενο ανατολικό ζήτημα, η αποσύνθεση δηλαδή της Οθωμανικής Αυτοκρατορίας, με τη στάση των ευρωπαϊκών δυνάμεων απέναντι στην Ελληνική Επανάσταση του 1821? Και τελικά, πόσο δυτικο-δημοκρατική επανάσταση είναι αυτή που αναδεικνύει τον πρώτο μη προσωρινό της κυβερνήτη πάνω στη βάση «εις κύρανος έστω εις βασιλεύς»? Πόσο ελληνόφωνη είναι μια επανάσταση που εξελίσσεται από έναν υψηλάντη, το γένος της μητέρας Βακαρέσκου, και καθοδηγείται από έναν κάπο Ντίστρια και έναν Ρέγκολιντα Ρώμα? Αυτοί δεν είναι που προεπαναστατικά λένε στην αλληλογραφία τους ότι επιτέλους πρέπει να γράφουμε μεταξύ μας ελληνικά? Πόσο λαϊκή είναι μια επανάσταση που κινείται από πρίγκιπες, κόμιτες, στη βάση του «εν τούτο το σημείον οικόμεν, το σταυρό λέγω», και εκτελείται από λαϊκούς επαναστάτες που προστατεύουν τους προύχοντες στη βάση του «δεν είμαστε καρμπονάροι ή Ιακωβίνοι», όπως διακήρυσε ο Κολοκοτρώνης? Υπάρχει τέλος το μεγάλο ένιγμα της Ρωσίας. Χωρίς τη Ρωσία η Ελληνική Επανάσταση μπορεί να μην είχε ξεκινήσει το 1821 ή σίγουρα θα ήταν πολύ διαφορετική από την Επανάσταση που γνωρίζουμε. Η Ρωσία δεν είναι μια τυχαία χώρα στην οποία ζουν Έλληνες εμιγκρέδες. Είναι η Μεγάλη Ορθόδοξη Αυτοκρατορία, που ήδη από τα μέσα του 18ου αιώνα εξελίσσει ένα σχέδιο με τη Μεγάλη Εκατερίνη στο πλαίσιο ανασύστασης της Μεγάλης Χριστιανικής Αυτοκρατορίας. Θυμίζω ότι η Εκατερίνη είχε αλληλογραφία με τον Βολτέρο, ο οποίος την προέτρεπε να χρηστεί αυτοκράτηρα των Ελλήνων, και η ίδια είχε βαφτίσει τον εγγονό της Κωνσταντίνο, του είχε Ελληνίδα παιδαγωγό, θεωρώντας ότι θα αναλάβει τον θρόνο του στην Κωνσταντινούπολη. Παρ' όλα αυτά, όταν ξεσπάει η Επανάσταση, καταφθάνουν φιλέλληνες για να πολεμήσουν υπέρ των Ελλήνων, ακόμα και από τις Ηνωμένες Πολιτείες της Αμερικής. Δεν κατεβαίνει όμως σχεδόν κανένας Ρώσος. Οι Γερμανοί, Γάλλοι, Βρετανοί, Ιταλοί, ακόμα και Πολωνοί είναι αυτοί που χύνουν το αίμα τους για την Ελλάδα. Όταν ο Μπάιρον φτάνει στο Μεσολόγγι, ο Πούσκιν, που παραλίγο να ακολουθήσει τον Υψηλάντη στην περιπέτειά του, εκφράζεται μάλλον άσχημα για τους Έλληνες και την Επανάσταση. Δεν συνεχίζω. Είμαι βέβαιος ότι ο καθηγητής μας θα μας λύσει πολλές από αυτές τις απορίες και θα μας μοιήσει στο μυστήριο αυτό που ονομάζεται Ελληνική Επανάσταση του 1821. Σας ευχαριστώ πολύ. Να πω επίσης ότι προτρέπω όλους τους συμπαρίκους μας να συμμετέχουν ενεργά στις εκδηλώσεις της κοινότητας, οι οποίες είναι πολλές και αξιόλογες, και να έχουμε έτσι την ευκαιρία αυτή τη χρονιά να βρεθούμε πολλές φορές μαζί και να ακούσουμε πολλά. Σας ευχαριστώ πολύ.
Greeting everyone. Kalispera σας. A virtual welcome to all those following us out there in cyberspace, and a much relieved welcome to those who have chosen to join us in the flesh at the main mezzanine level of the Greek Centre. And also, it's my turn also to welcome the General Consul. Καλώς ήρθες, Γενικέ, και ελπίζω αυτά τα χρόνια να τα περάσεις καλά και δυνατά και καλή τύχη σε όλα. Also, I'd like to thank the sponsor of tonight's seminar, Anastasia Sogleris, who unfortunately is not here with us today. It's been a much anticipated reunion. We've all missed each other's company and the weekly banter. But before I proceed with tonight's topic and speaker, allow me to go through some housekeeping items and announcements. Towards the end of the seminar, you're encouraged, for those who are online, you're encouraged to submit your questions through the chat function on Zoom. I'll send that a reminder. Those present at the mezzanine level, we've got a mic set up in the corner that you'll be able to use. Also, just a reminder that next week's seminar is also a hybrid seminar. Then we have about a month of online seminars because we also get kicked out because of the Comedy Festival, and we return to the hybrid format on the 22nd of April. Also, a reminder that next week's seminar would also be part of the Greek Community's International's Women's Day program. It will be a hybrid event. It will be in the Greek language. The Crete-based, I think Erasmus-based academic, Dr. Eleftheria Zey, will be speaking on the trials and tribulations of Madonna Vrougienus, one of the heroines of the Greek Revolution. There'll also be a welcoming by the President of Greece, Katerina Sakelloropoulou, and we hope to have a bit of a party at the mezzanine level. Because we've got a minimum capacity of 80, when you get the email notification and you want to attend the mezzanine level, you need to book through trybooking.com. Okay. Let's return to tonight's seminar. Did the Greek Revolution of 1821 really happen? Myths, counter-myths, and historical knowledge by Professor Vrasidas Karalis from the University of Sydney. I've lost track of how many times I've had to introduce Professor Karalis. He needs no introduction to most of you. And I personally can't imagine a seminar series without him present and his contribution. So Vrasida, if you ever want to escape the state of Gladistan and seek asylum in the cultural capital of Australia, Melbourne, you'll always be welcome in open arms. Some may consider Professor Karalis as melodramatic, prone to exaggeration, mischievous, eccentric, provocative. You can come up with a few more adjectives. But alongside that, one must also consider his many redeeming features, his unbridled passion, his extensive knowledge, his intellectual wit, his piercing observations, and his generosity in sharing his thoughts. One can never come to one of his seminars without being stretched, without questioning one's existing thoughts and opinions. And with a title like tonight's, Did the Greek Revolution Really Happen? Myths, counter-myths, historical knowledge, a combative ambience has already been laid. His abstract certainly got me fired up. I quote, "The paper also discusses some rather overlooked interpretations of the revolution with special emphasis on Arnold Toynbee. The historian Arnold Toynbee hasn't been the flavor of the month for quite a few decades. After 1960, Toynbee's ideas faded both in academia and the media to the point of seldom being quoted. In general, historians pointed to his preference of myths, allegories, and religion over factual data. His critics argued that his conclusions are more those of a Christian moralist than of a historian. One critic even came forward with the following observation. To many historians today, Arnold Toynbee is regarded like an embarrassing uncle at a house party. He gets a requisite introduction by virtue of his place in the family tree, but is quickly passed over for other friends and relatives. But why has our dear Professor Karalis turned to this ugly duckling of history, at least from the perception of modern historians? Enough for me. Enjoy the seminar, enjoy the talk. I pass the baton to Professor Karalis to deliver the story.
Thank you, Nico, for your lovely and sometimes ambiguous presentation. I wouldn't like to be anything else but an ambiguous personality, as I said. And so this gives the opportunity to people to criticize you in all possible ways. So criticism is a Greek word, as you know, and we have to build on criticism, the critical knowledge of the past. I would like to thank also the new Consul General of Greece to Melbourne for his warm welcome, and we reciprocate and say, well, we give you a well welcome to the capital of the Greeks of the Antipodes, which is unfortunately Melbourne and not Sydney, where I am at the moment. And I would like to thank also the Greek community of Melbourne for organizing these seminars and putting forward, I would say, some new ideas about Greek past, what happened, how we see it today, how we could revisit it, how we could reconsider it, and finally, how we would like to actually to proceed towards the future with a new way, with a fresh way of looking towards the past. As you remember from all the lectures,
Βρασίδα, έχεις παγώσει.
well, this is the problem with the hybrids. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
This is the problem with the hybrids. So, this is, if whenever I phrase, just give me the raise hand to stop, so we'll start again, all right, if you don't mind. So what I was saying is that there were so many things that we can revisit because we have the tyranny of the past on the lived experience of the present. This is a very important problem that we have as Greeks and as scholars and as individuals to address. That's why I wanted to be provocative today with this question, this lecture on Greek history and especially the Greek Revolution. So my presentation today will be a sort of kind encapsulated in a series of questions that I have for you. And if I may share my screen here, that'll be easier for all of us to see what I mean. And because essentially what I wanted to see is, I'll go to the first one, 3 questions in this lecture, because I know that we have only 45 minutes and I don't want to keep you longer. Did the Greek Revolution really happen? What were the results of the revolution? And finally, which is the most vexed and most, if I may say, ambivalent question that we have to answer and address in this lecture, in this discussion? Did the Greek state create the ethnos, or the ethnos created the state? It's a very important question amongst historians at the moment, and I think that you have invited a prominent historian of Greece to close this series of lectures, who will probably address this issue in a very interesting way. I would like to continue here with this because for me, the Greek Revolution was a momentous event in the history of the Greeks, and we must study it carefully and systematically in order to explore its long-term consequences on their life and identity. Because of its complex nature, it has caused an enormous controversy about its character and about its purpose. The Consul General mentioned some of these debates, and I'll come back to them later on. Even today, the discussions are almost along partisan lines, and the left political ideology tend to see a social uprising against feudal overlords, whereas the right historians, a national revolution against foreign oppression. The truth, of course, is, as in everything, that the Greek Revolution was both of the above plus something extra. National, social, political, cultural, or otherwise, the revolution established a completely new reality for the Greeks themselves, producing a new form of social organization in the Balkans and in the East, and finally created new movements of political emancipation that went beyond the boundaries of the small Greek state that was created at the end. Also, the revolution was organized by various social groups who discovered their commonalities during the events of the revolution, during the deliberations about the society. And finally, because they all tried to avoid the dominant predicament of the second-class citizen, irrespective of their wealth or their connection in the Ottoman Empire. I would like to address, I mentioned twice today, Kolokotronis, because I know that most of you have been almost, just enchanted, I would say to a certain degree, brainwashed by the Makrianis memoirs. What has been really disregarded and overlooked, that they are essentially the memoirs of Kolokotronis, because Kolokotronis was the real leader, military, and to a certain degree, symbolic leader of the Greek Revolution. Very few people read his memoirs, unless they are Peloponnesians and proud. And in a sort of kind of Kolokotronis had an incredibly, if I may say, accurate perception of how the Greeks, who were the Greeks who started organizing themselves in order to rebel against the Ottoman sovereign. I'm reading this very simple excerpt from his memoirs. But he said the leadership of the Greek army is a tyranny because you have to be the leader and the judge and the supervisor. And one day they were coming back and the next day they were leaving. You are forced to maintain the whole army together with lies and flattering and fairy tales, without food for the horses, without ammunition, whereas everyone was ignoring the commands of the leader. In Europe, however, the general issues his commands to his generals, the generals to the colonels, and the colonels to the brigadiers, and this is how the hierarchy works. This is the way to organize your army and go on. If Wellington had given me 40,000 troops, I could be their leader. If he was given 500 Greeks, he wouldn't last for a single hour. Every Greek has his own whims, and if you want to do something together, you must scare them, as he said. So we have to understand this because he also states, Kolokotronis, in a very interesting and brilliant passage of his memoirs, that society, he says, as we know it, was back then, before the revolution, too small. It was only our revolution that made the Greeks to know each other. Εσχετίστηκαν οι Έλληνες μεταξύ των, όπως γράφει. There were people who didn't know, not even any other village 1 hour away from theirs. We thought that Zakynthos was in the remotest parts of the world. It was like what America was for the Franks. My intention, therefore, is to see how the whole thing organized synchronically. The Consul General also talked about Paparigopoulos and the way that he essentially created a narrative about the Greeks and the Greek Revolution. We must not forget that this happened 30 or 40 years later, right? When the revolution has become already a legend. Most people were dead by then, and most people actually, most political ideologies have changed about the past. And my attempt in this presentation is always to find sources that are contemporaneous with the events that happened. Έχω μία συγχρονική ανάγνωση της ιστορίας. So that's a very important thing because essentially, as you remember, every time we discuss about the Greeks and what happened in the Greek Revolution, we immediately have questions, and this is the most, essentially, I would say, controversial part of all, questions about Greek identity, about origins, and about the character of the Greeks in a strange, and that was way that was felt immediately after the revolution. I don't want to insist on that because that will take out of our just the main purpose of this discussion. I would like to remind you here of the furore that Falmeraier's theory caused just a few years after the establishment of the Greek state, or the continuous questioning of the nature of the revolution itself in many occasions, especially by Marxist historians and thinkers, like, for example, Yannis Kordatos, Kostas Valetas, Kostas Psiroukis, or more recently, sorry, Nick, by Andonis Liakos and his entourage, if we ever can call them, of course, Marxists. So beyond the uprising and the military success of the revolution, we must admit that a new cultural and political problematic emerged out of the struggles of the revolutionaries, both against the Ottomans and also against each other, but also with each other. The problematic referred to the new forms of social organization that were still emerging in Europe in that period. And this is the meaning of this map that I have here. Today, we take for granted the reality and the side effects of the nation state as the dominant form of social organization. The nation state today sounds as an obsolete and reactionary form of structuring identity and public sphere. But if we could go back in time, that was not the case in the early 20th century. Until then, we had no nation states. Not even France was not a nation state, a pure nation state by then. And most people lived side by side in multinational, multilingual, and multicultural societies governed by an imperial system, which was not always benign or benevolent, that many historians try to argue about. For some reason, and I think you have to see that with some of you will see that with some of the historians you have invited in this series. For some reason, strange, I would say, and somehow bizarre, the Ottoman Empire has become the paradise lost of all postmodernist historians. They thought that it was the most peaceful and most functional empire in the world, especially in the 18th and 19th century. And especially many Greek historians present the Ottoman Empire as a place of relative social harmony and peace, things that we cannot really justify from the original sources, and especially sources written by even non-Greeks at that period. The Ottoman Empire, of course, changed, and this is the purpose of this map here. And in the 400, 500 years of its existence, as we see today in contemporary Turkey, there were always two projects in its political horizon, one towards Vienna and the other one towards the Iran and Central Asia. These projects redefined the Ottoman Empire, especially during the period of its expansion by military force, conquest, and subjugation. When this ended after the defeat of the Ottomans in Vienna in 1683, and the treaty with Russia in the early 18th century, the gradual decline of the imperial system of Sultan was becoming visible. So, when the Greeks of Morea, of the Peloponnese, asked from the Pasha of Thebes to take over their land from the Venetians in 1712, they couldn't predict the new realities emerging by the end of the same century, when the empire was fighting rebellions, secessionist movements, to which it responded with massacres and deportation of populations. That meant that the empire was malfunctioning. It didn't have a cohesive fabric that could keep these people together, except always, as happened during the Ottoman Empire, the military. And the military was something that, as we know from the past, was not always very, very sort of a kind, if I may say, welcome by the people in many, many parts of the empire. Things became even more critical after the French Revolution and the influx of new ideas from the campaigns, almost likely through the personality of Napoleon. Kolokotronis again was adamant that the impact of the French Revolution Napoleon in the gradual process of this transformation, it was the catalyst for changes in the Ottoman Empire. The other dimension, and I think the Consul General mentioned that, we have to remember, is that essentially at the Congress of Vienna in 1815, defined the framework of all international politics and the balance of power in Europe over the next 100 years and the end of World War II. For some of you who are interested, you remember that this is essentially the thesis that on which Henry Kissinger worked, right? The Congress of Vienna in 1815, and especially his beloved diplomat Metternich, the one who, according to the tradition, hated the Greeks. Therefore, we can understand the Greek Revolution, the significance of the Greek Revolution, without exploring we cannot understand the significance without exploring that background that make the Greeks so rebellious and the revolution so revolutionary. A grand pan-European status quo was simply suspended by the revolution to the degree that in the end, the great powers which guaranteed the inalienable rights of sovereigns had to intervene militarily in Navarino in order to impose an amendment to the diplomacy of Count Metternich. The establishment of the Greek state, which to a degree is different to the succession of the Greek Revolution, to the success of the Greek Revolution, was an irregularity in the world of security, autocratic absolutism, and the police state that Metternich wanted to impose and become the dominant regime of all European empires, including the Ottoman. It led, however, the revolution, to the gradual dissolution of everything that was prescribed by the Congress and created the chaos that Romanticism used it as an existential ground to reshape European culture and European political life. So this leads to my first question. Did the Greek Revolution really happen? I will start with a very simple answer. Yes, it did. You know it. But when and how? The Greek Revolution broke out in 1821, but existentially and essentially, it was a long process which was accelerated and intensified at the beginning of the 19th century. I see the Greek Revolution as a process which started in the form of liberating Greece in the early 18th century and continued through all these rebellions, which I have them in Greek here to see them, which started the first rebellion in 1457, as you see. And we had, as the Consul General said, almost a rebellion, a revolution every 10 years throughout Greece, the Greek lands, as you see, incredibly important in this case, constantly until 1821. And essentially, as you will see, it was the first form of this rebellion against the Ottomans and continued as an active resistance throughout the 16th, 17th, and 18th century. For some of you who know, 16th century was the darkest period of the Greek, if I may say, ethnos. We must remember the concept of ethnos in this case, and the way that the Ottomans, the Ottoman Sultan, especially under the Selim the Grim, imposed forced Islamizations. This is when the Islamization of the half of the Albanians took place, and some other places around Europe. It was afterwards after the conquest of Crete, we have forced Islamizations in Crete as well. And you have the paradox in 1922 that we had a lot of Turco-Cretans who were Greek, but of Muslim, but then of the Muslim faith. So I just want to say that resistance was everywhere. I mean, many historians tend to underestimate the feeling of unrest and restlessness that we had throughout the Ottoman Empire for many, many, many centuries. That was expressed through, I would say, the diaspora, first of all, that many Greeks left the place and went elsewhere to study. And then finally, me as a teacher, I have to say that, I have to mention that, a form of resistance is the building of schools and the activity to educate Greek-speaking communities all over the Ottoman Empire about the historical lineage and the geographical position of modern Greeks. Geography was part of the political emancipation, the project of the political emancipation of the Greek nation in the 18th century. It is interesting that the same period, the common names used until then to indicate the Greeks were Romyi and Greki, and gradually replaced, of course, by that of Hellenes, of Hellenes. The process, as I mentioned, was not simply towards the establishment of a state, but that did really exist in the mental horizon of the people. First, were self-government, autonomia, as you remember, and then, as you see, we had the idea of establishment of an independent area for themselves. When in 1601, the dog philosopher, Dionysius philosophers, organized a rebellion, and it was widely believed to be that the Bishop of Tricky will regain Byzantium. This indicated not an attempt to build a new state, but to revive a previous one. Tricky, Byzantium, Anaktisi was a sort of an idea that was running around in that period. The connection with Byzantium was always a common background, despite, as you remember, some of you who had discussed that a few years ago in the same series of lectures, despite the consternation of all representatives of Enlightenment, especially Karalis and the other representatives as well, who saw Byzantium as every representative of the Enlightenment used to see as a period of decline. As you remember, the famous historian of the English historian Gibbon said, now he said, I will talk about he says in the 16th book of his famous The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, I will talk about the triumph of religion and barbarism. So this association of religion with barbarism remained the same sort of, if I may say, motif of all representatives, thinkers of the Enlightenment, and Karalis was one of them. That's why the church was always very, very cautious towards Karalis. So my point is, the controversial point, is that the Megali Idea was not concocted by Koletis after the establishment of the Greek state. In the form of oral culture, prophecies, don't forget that prophecies in that period, which were actually could be read, could be understood by everybody, was like what Twitter is today to people of the technological era. So, but the idea of the Megali Idea became dominant after the establishment of the Greek state. But before, the idea of Byzantium, of the polis being the center of Hellenism, was always dominant. The painting, for example, I would like to show you by Zographos about the fall of Constantinople, made as early as 1836, depicts the continuity of vision between the fallen capital that we see with the Sultan here, and then in the same painting, on the same surface, we have what happened afterwards. The people, Rigas here, and the clefts, look at here, who actually come back to reclaim the city. The painting of Zographos about the fall of Constantinople, as I said, depicts the continuity between the fallen capital and the idea of its restoration through the revolution, always lurking in the background through the clefts. You can't see them clearly here because they're very small, but it's a very interesting detail of the painting that within one surface, we have 500 years of historical evolution, an extremely interesting sort of kind of, if I may say, point of discussion here. The Greek Revolution, therefore, was a prolonged process until 1821, with a constant attempt to find an appropriate political form. The French Revolution, as interpreted by Rigas Ferreos, this one here, gave a new way of organizing societies with which the revolution is appropriated to a certain degree, although it was becoming increasingly obvious that many radical elements had to be expunged from this vision. For some of you who don't have the time to discuss about that, you remember I believe that the fate of modern Greece and about its character, about its ideas and perceptions about that, was already defined before the establishment of the Greek state, essentially when Eugenius Vulgaris, a priest who was the main representative of the Enlightenment, recanted, took everything back after a while, and said, no way, we cannot continue that because all of them are atheists and they're going to destroy religion. Even later on, Konstantinos Dimaras claimed after the establishment of the Greek state that especially after 1844, we observe in historical development, in the historical becoming of the country, what he called an anaschiasi to διαφωτισμού, a reversal of the Enlightenment project as inherited to us by the revolution. So the second question about the results of the revolution, very, very important, as you understand as well, but I'm not going to insist on that because it's a very important issue and I think we are getting late already. What are the results of the revolution? First of all, it established a political center. It's the first time in the history of Greece, the history of Greeks, that we have a political center for its social existence. The Greeks had many political centers. They had Constantinople, they had Smyrna, they had Alexandria, they had Odessa. Karalis in 1815 says that the political center of Greece at the moment is Vienna. So as you see, the political center was moving. It's the first time that we have a political center fixed in a specific territory. Don't forget, of course, since it was mentioned before as well by the Consul General, that the first governor of Greece insisted that the political center of modern Greece should have been Nafplion and not Athens. The second thing that happened is the establishment of a social and public sphere around that political center. And something very important, which we could spend hours discussing, I believe, is the gradual transformation of dispersed cultural communities into a unified political nationhood. The Greeks never had the perception from antiquity, and that's a very important thing, I'll come back to this, that they were a unified nation. Regionalism rules supreme to this day. The Greek state, as was established, was for the first time trying to give them a space for all of them to coexist. A very ambitious political project. For some of you who have seen the comedy by Vrasidas called Babylonia, behind the dialectical differences, we cite cultural differences and the inability for all these people to communicate and be in one place. But the one place is given. And that, what was that? The locanda, over here. And what's the locanda? Is the cafenio that became dominant, the coffee shops that became dominant in Athens, and all these differences started actually melting together and creating a political nationhood. So this is my criticism as well of many postmodernist historians. They confuse the cultural community that we have in Pontus, cultural community we have in Cyprus, as a political nation, and that was not the case. Political nation came through the state in the country. For some of you, of course, there in Melbourne, I just tried to find this one to show you. The Greek state gave you only these things, all right? As you said, which is 200 years αδέσποτα χρόνια, διαφθορά, ρουσφέτια, καπιταλισμός, κλειδών δημοσίων υπαλλήλων. That's a very interesting political take on the problem. But if we follow the maps from antiquity, we will see that the Greeks were dispersed everywhere. How can unify all these dispersed cultures, all these dispersed populations in one, through one political center? It's impossible, as you understand. The same happens later on. This is the map that Venizelos gave in 1918 after the Paris Peace Conference after the First World War, in order to show, look at the yellow, how the Greeks were everywhere. How can you unify all these people in one territory? It is impossible. You have to bring them all together. Something else we have to change an idea, Alves, is that essentially many people say that Greeks, and your friend, Mr. Markou Varoufakis, had made a famous program about this, that the people who spoke Albanian, Arvanitika, were not Greek, which is, as you understand, one of the most horrible oversimplifications that I have heard in my life, because language defines identity, but not always identity is defined by language. And I can't think that Bubulina, who spoke Arvanitika very well, was not fighting for a Greek cause, for Greek freedom. It's a very silly oversimplification, I would say. The same can be seen, as you understand, with a difference in the Greek population that suddenly have been essentially contracted into this national territory that we have, which is a serious problem, as you see, and we have to discuss it for another day. Now, the third thing we have to discuss is, did the Greek state create the ethnos, or the ethnos created the state? Nick mentioned about Toynbee, but Nick, I will disappoint you. I'll leave Toynbee outside at this case, because Toynbee is his book, The Greeks and Their Heritages, is a book of immense and intense guilt for what he did in 1920. So I won't go there, and we'll discuss that later on. So as you know, in Greece at the moment, we have this intellectual battle between what I call historicism and constructivism. And essentially, if the question was, what became first, the nation or the state? Did the state create the nation, or the nation created the state? In Europe, we have many nation states, like some nation states, like Switzerland or Belgium, without a distinct nationality, as you know, or ethnicity. And we have actually many other nations that the state co-evolved at the same time. At the same time that the nation was formed, the state was essentially organically coming out of that process. That's why what we call today in geopolitics the civilizational state, that you see that Russia, China, India, and Turkey want to become at the moment. So this is a very important question in this case in our discussion. So a critical knowledge with the ideals of the Greek Revolution will give the opportunity to revitalize and reimagine, I believe, contemporary Greek identity. I have mentioned it again and again, that contemporary Greek identity is founded only indirectly at the moment on the legacies of the Greek Revolution. Contemporary Greek identity sees the names of the revolutionaries as escapist symbolic landscapes, if not for jingoistic purposes. We see everything, and I insist on that, we see everything through the lens of a trauma, or indeed of successive traumas of the 20th century, starting with the foundational psychological reality of all Greek forms of self-definition, the Asia Minor catastrophe. I know that we all tend to forget what happened in 1922. It is a trauma without closure, without catharsis. We were not allowed to speak about the Asia Minor catastrophe until 1970 and 80. Nobody has been ever, if you remember, in 1998, a Greek court acquitted the 6 people who were executed for what happened in Asia Minor. And But all of this with closed doors. We don't know what was discussed in there. It's a great secret and enigma that essentially blocks and blurs our vision towards the past. So it's also the traumas of the Second World War, the Civil War, the mass migration, all played this role. Also, modern deconstructive historians are unable to reconstruct the past in its own terms. That to project contemporary ideas and values on the past, and therefore find only asymmetries and contradictions, is, I think, very ahistorical, unhistorical in this case. Claiming that the Greek state created Greek identity is a magical, in the Freudian sense, of the simplification if we have the birth of a nation as a creation out of nothing. At the moment that the symbols, and that's why I have the first, as you see here, Greek flag that we had in that period from Chios, at the moment that we have the first symbols, we immediately see here in the left, as you look at this, the crown of the last emperor of Byzantium. The continuity between the past and the present was always, as you will see, I believe, very common in the Greek identity in this case. It's true that the Greek state imposed a certain strange amalgam of the historical knowledge because he chose, as you see, especially the official bureaucracy of the Greek state chose a specific version of Greek identity. The Consul General also mentioned here this gentleman here who is Konstantinos Paparigopoulos. Paparigopoulos, as you see, as a Phanariot, had his own sort of ideas about what constituted Greekness, or as I call it, Hellenicity. And he wanted to secularize Greek identity. In a way, in the 19th century, we went back to the 15th century, and before the fall of Constantinople, and the questions, the debate that we had between Pletho and Scholarius, are the Greeks Hellenes or Christians? Remember the famous debate between Pletho and Scholarius. The dilemma remained unanswered because of the Ottoman conquest and resurfaced again before the revolution. In the constitutions of the revolution, and we will read something at the end, until 1843, we can clearly detect the struggle between secular and religious understandings of identity. I will have another opportunity to talk about the first constitution as a Zoom meeting, so I strongly recommend you to discuss that, because it's a vexed and vexing issue, as the first Greek constitution said that only those who believe in Christ are Greeks. So that was a very interesting point that we had there. Yet the revolution was made by people who are not very particularly close to the church or even to Christianity. Karalis, for example, was very close to Protestantism. Makriyanis was very orthodoxist in a sense. He had this very traditional perception of orthodoxy. At the same time, you have Kairis, Theophilos Kairis, one of the most important personalities of the revolution, who created his own religion at the same time. Or at the same time, you had Alexandros Mavrokordatos, so viciously maligned by many people, who believed only in projects of civil identity, like the English had back then. Or Koletis, who had an idea of nationalist populism. And then finally, all of these things came together under an absolutist monarch, as expressed by the first Bavarian king of Greece, Otto. Paparigopoulos wrote his history when a change was taking place under Otto. From the early dilemmas of the democratic civil society and their gradual transformation into the institutional practices of legitimacy and legality, the ideals of the Greek society had mutated into different forms and practices. His history, Paparigopoulos' history, whose first form was written in 1853 as a school manual, delineated the gradual disillusion with politics, and especially the extremely striking disenchantment with all revolutionary projects that we see until then. Revolution under absolute monarchy meant sedition and dismantling what had been achieved by them. The ethnos, as understood by him, was not the ethnos of Karalis, and most importantly, of this gentleman here, whose work I strongly recommend you to discover, Konstantinos Koumas. It was an ahistorical category. Paparigopoulos saw ethnos as something above human beings, right? And therefore, through his ideas, was that the Greeks became Greeks because there was a metaphysical entity which he called the ethnos. On the contrary, we have this man here called Konstantinos Koumas from Larissa, who didn't write the history of the Greek nation, but he wrote the Historie των ανθρωπίνων πράξεων, the histories of human actions, activities, which actually he believes that historical is not what is metaphysical, but what actually people do. And that's why he called him the Historia των ανθρωπίνων πράξεων. And here you see himself, as a historical agent. And I strongly recommend you to read, to find this book of him, which is an excerpt from his 12th volume, The Hellenes, where he gives us a very detailed analysis of what happened during the revolution and how they gradually transformed the whole situation gradually. So how the whole original, perception of the past that we had during the revolution. We must never forget that historians have their own agendas. They can reconstruct the past, but we can reconstruct the past as well. But how can we know the past as it was? We have to remember, and this is how I would like to finish before getting into my last point. So Koumas and Karalis believe that the Greeks become Greeks because of self-education and self-improvement. They had to read and rediscover the connection with the past. And that had nothing to do with territory. They need to establish a coherent, cohesive social sphere under a strange alliance between the Phanariots and the weak mercantile class of ship owners and contractors, the imported bureaucracy, and finally foreign overlords, was totally, if I may say, out of the horizon, the intellectual horizon, absent of the intellectual horizon of the revolutionaries. Therefore, Queen Victoria thought of Greece as a toy kingdom, as she used to say. And this indicates a total change of perspective, as we see, from this Delacroix, painting, which changed essentially the perception of the Greek Revolution, to what we see later on as a cartoon. The revolution becomes a cartoon, becomes something, fake, something unreal in this case. The transformation, as you see, is rather sad and frustrating. Toynbee, like Koumas, tried to give us essentially what we call in historiography the long duration of history. That is to say, we try to give us the long narrative that goes from antiquity to this day. Koumas believed, like many other historians, like Zvoronos, that the Greek nation began its historical existence in its current form after 1204, after the Fourth Crusade, and especially after 1453. The continuity between the state as a free society and the Greek communities as enslaved communities is essentially, you can see that very obvious. It remained until quite recently, and we're still having to address this problem of how the transformation of an Ottoman, almost semi-feudal, province of an empire was transformed into a state that privileges law, privileges institutions, and privileges essentially process. Now, of course, this didn't happen always in Greece, but this is the story you have to remember. So I believe that this we have to take seriously these ideas that we have from the revolutionaries. Because the revolutionaries essentially left behind, let me see, so stop sharing here, left to us something very important, and I would like only to read to you in Greek. Because this is essentially what we see here is the declaration of the Greeks in 1821, when the revolution started bringing the people together. It was not something prefabricated, as you see. It was something that it was creating spontaneously and through deliberations its own principles and its own future. This is the beginning of the Constitution, the προσωρινό πολίτευμα της Ελλάδος. Το ελληνικό έθνος, το υπό τη φρικόδινο Οθωμανική δυναστεία μη δυνάμενο να φέρει των βαρύτατων και απαραδειγμάτιστων ζυγών της τυραννίας και αποσύσαν αυτών μεγάλες θυσίας, κηρύττει σήμερα δια των νομίμων παρασταντών του εις εθνικήν συνηγμένων συνέλευσιν ενώπιον Θεού και ανθρώπων, and this is the important thing, την πολιτικήν αυτού ύπαρξην και ανεξαρτησία. This statement, which is totally very simple today because we don't pay much attention to this kind of old documents, indicates what was in the mind of the individual, of the revolutionaries. Πολιτική ύπαρξης, therefore political identity and independence. Only for the thinkability, as Castoriadis would have said, of these principles, we must be eternally grateful to the Greek revolutionaries, not because we are Greek, but because a new perception of democratic citizenship emerged then and was proposed by the revolutionaries, which we must revisit with a critical knowledge and somehow something we seem to have totally lost in our affluent and spectacular societies of consumption and money, a sense of humility. If we don't understand the problems and the dilemmas of these people, then we become unfair to the past. We use the past as a narcissistic projection of our own, if I may say, dead-end dilemmas and somehow impasse existential problems. This, the Constitution is very interesting. I don't know if you have read it in this case, but essentially, as you see, όσοι αυτόχθονες κάτοικοι της επικρατείας πιστεύουσι Χριστόν, οι Έλληνες και απολαμβάνουσι ανευθυνώς διαφορά όλων των πολιτικών δικαιωμάτων. Όλοι οι Έλληνες, οι όμοιοι ενώπιον των νόμων, ανευθυνώς εξαιρέσεως ή βαθμού ή κλάσεως ή αξιώματος. Όσοι έξωθεν ελθόντες κατοικήσωσιν ή παροικήσωσιν στην επικράτεια της Ελλάδος, εισήν όμοιοι με τους αυτόχθονες κατοίκους ενώπιον των νόμων. Η διοίκηση θέλει φροντίσει να εκδώσει προσεχώς νόμο περί πολιτογραφήσεως των ξένων, όσοι έχουν την επιθυμία να γίνουν Έλληνες. Όλοι οι Έλληνες, εις όλα τα αξιώματα και τιμάς, έχουν το αυτό δικαίωμα. Δοτήρ δε τούτων μόνον η αξιότης εκάστου. It's the first time that we have a document to speak about this meritocracy, about equality, about equity, and finally, as you see, the possibility of bringing all these people together, έξωθεν, the heterochthonous, and become the same as the αυτόχθονες κάτοικοι της Greece, ενώπιον των νόμων. This is a statement that I think that we have to take seriously, look back with the revolution with the humility that it deserves. We actually deserve it more than the revolution itself, and discover this incredible complexity and the incredible, I would say in this case, ambivalence that the people who participated in the revolution felt towards their own work. Yet the work was a collective creation, not an individual creation. As Kolokotroni said, we were all together in this. Even Makriani said, we are in the time of the Emis, not to ego. With this, I just want to tell you that I believe that the Greek Revolution was probably one of the most important political events of the 19th century. It established a new polity, social policy, a new perception of citizenship. Finally, although aborted, as you understand, never created, it never became reality, created the first perception of meritocracy in the East. Something which, if you have the opportunity to go through this document, which is very, very brief, as you see, you'll discover that it's an extremely interesting document, extremely inspiring to this day. My perception is that the Greek Revolution deserves more respect and much more, if I may say, beyond the mythologization that we saw with the Committee of for 200 years in Greece. It deserves more study and more personal engagement with us. As a teacher at the university, I always teach the foundational texts of modern Greek nationhood. And the foundational text is the first constitution of Epidavros and Trizina in 1821. I strongly recommend you to read it, and I believe this must be the end of my lecture. Thank you for your patience, and I hope we didn't lose a lot.
Thank you, Vrasidas, for that thought-provoking presentation, and I'm sure there'll be a few questions for you. Costa, can we focus back on Vrasidas? And Vrasidas, can you just maybe open up the Q&A so our audience at the mezzanine can also see the questions?
Well, I had a very beautiful message on the chat by my former student, Arthur Spiro, who is the Australian ambassador in Athens, all right? You can read it if you want. Thank you, Arthur.
Vrasidas, can you click on Q&A, please? Just click on Q&A and I'll read out the questions.
Yep. Yes?
Can you click on Q&A? I don't see it.
I did.
Oh. Signal me.
Okay. I clicked. I can see it.
Okay. It's okay. Okay. We've got our controller here.
Yeah.
Okay. Our first question is from Konstantinos Spiropoulos. Do you consider the establishment of the Kingdom of Greece in 1832 not a reflection of the revolutionaries' aspirations, but a mirror image of what the Congress of Vienna in 1815 espoused by Metternich?
No, because by then Metternich was on the decline. He was on the way out. I think the establishment of the Greek state against the professed and expressed will of Metternich meant essentially the end of his model of organizing the European continent. Well, Metternich was very strong always, as you remember, until his death. But I think the Greek Revolution, the establishment of the Greek state, was one of the most important defeats that he had in his political career. That's why we have in Greece later on the idea of an Anthelinus, that he was really against the Greeks. Right? My perception is that the establishment of the Kingdom of Greece was an establishment. Don't forget that Constantine. May I say that during the conference, the Congress of Vienna, Metternich had an opponent, and that was Capodistrias. And because the Kingdom of Greece was established in 1832, but the independent state of Greece under Capodistrias was something that Metternich never wanted it.
Okay, thank you.
So that's my question, my answer.
All right. Next question from George Vrasidas.
Yeah.
Mentioned controversies in analysis of the history of the Greek Revolution. There are some who argue that the preeminent or major cause of the 1821 insurrection was the spiritual motivation provided by the Orthodox Christian faith, and that those who fought were guided more by the value of orthodoxy than secular slogans of the Enlightenment. Indeed, it is argued that most of the fighters were literate and would not have been aware of external events such as the French Revolution, whereas others believe it was a catalyst for revolutionary fervor in Greece. What is your view on this?
Now, I think we underestimate. The whole of society then was illiterate, right? They couldn't read. There were very few people who could read. But the dissemination of ideas was extremely, essentially, beyond the ideas. It was not happening in the way that we do it today, right? There were places where people met and discussed this and things. I think we tend to underestimate the networks of communication that the revolutionaries and the people had back then. Many people were illiterate, but this doesn't mean that they hadn't heard about the French Revolution. Some of them were, if you remember, if I may say, Mr. Vardas, experienced the French Revolution in the Seven Islands in the beginning of the 19th century, when the French were there and burned all the Libro d'Oro, and they abolished all the traditional aristocratic sort of if I may say, structure of society for over 700, which had lasted 700 years. So these ideas were everywhere. If you had a look at Kolokotronis's memoirs, Kolokotronis was also illiterate. He heard about this when he was in Zakynthos. He actually went there, and he actually was exposed to these ideas himself without being able to read himself the whole, especially in French in this case. So these ideas were very, very common in that period. Sorry, I try to. Can you hear me well? Μπορείτε να μ' ακούσετε ή έχουμε πάθει τώρα?
Μια χαρά.
Ζητώ συγγνώμη. I know that the voice is lost somehow, but the phone is. So I don't think that the people were illiterate. I don't think that the Orthodox Church was as negative as it has been described against these ideas. They were always lurking there, and they were afraid of excesses, as they said, υπερβολές, όπως λέγαμε there. The Orthodox Church was very, in the beginning, as I said, very supportive of this, but then stopped because of the French Revolution, when they killed all the priests and they confiscated all churches, they demolished monasteries and these kind of things. But I don't think that many Greeks, I don't have to mention Papaflessa, I don't want to mention Palaion Patron Germano, I don't have to mention the lower clergy, but also at the Patriarchate, as you see, I think we tend to overestimate the reactionary character of the clergy. I think the clergy were always, because they were from the people, they were the populist. It's like very close to the people. They were not really a special caste that we had after the Counter-Reformation in the Catholic Church. The Greek clergy was very close to the people always, and they were very sort of a kind of problems were their problems. Don't forget that in many areas, like the Ambelakia, like these kind of things, when the Dimogerondes, the people were elected, the priests were abstained from this. They kicked them out. They kept them out of this. So there was a process that was taking place towards I call it the incomplete secularization of the Greek state, because later on the Greek state, through the absolute monarchy of Otto, changed that thing, right? Used the Orthodox Church in order to legitimize its authority as a monarch, because monarchy means religion. As King James of England said, no bishop, no king.
Thank you, Vrasidas. Let's move to the next question from Petros Rosakias. Do you feel that Greek independence from Ottoman rule was inevitable, and that the imperial nations such as Russia, France, and England sensed this and were making sure that they had a political foothold in modern Greek state? And just a second question, is it true that the Ottoman Empire did not occupy the Mani region, Peloponnesus?
Well, I mean, this, as I said, all the...
Βρασίδα, έχεις παγώσει λιγάκι. Can you refresh? Okay. Μίλα τώρα.
Yeah, all right. What I think that we have to see this attitude towards Greece from Russia, France, and England that has changed over the decades, all right? The beginning was positive, then became negative, and then became positive. Don't forget that the Greek loans of independence made Greece from the beginning financially and economically, in economic development, dependent on England. So it was always a problem there, the political foothold. But at the same time, we must never underestimate, if I may say, the struggle of the Greeks, of the ordinary Greeks, to be independent. And this is something that we tend to forget. We from today's perspective, always talk about the political history, what the political establishment, the political elites of the country were doing. In reality, you have to see that at the local level, let me use the expression, the grassroots level, the Greeks were very sort of a kind of opposed to all these things. That opposition, that resistance was expressed in many different ways. The banditry, and later on, as you see, I strongly recommend you to see a film by Angelopoulos, Theo Angelopoulos, Megalexandros, which is 4 hours long, and you will fall asleep. But then, as you see, it is a very important film which gives you in a symbolic form that constant resistance of the people against foreign intervention in the country.
Okay, and the just second part of that question about money.
About money, yeah, money. Listen, money was a very strange place always, like the άγραφα. Ελπίζω να μην είσαι από τα άγραφα που λένε το καρπενήσι there, because they're unwritten places as well, unscribed, because well, there was nothing to find in money, as you understand. Money was always a place without really real income. There are many places in Greece like this. For example, if you go to Santorini, Santorini never had any Turks there except one in a konaki, the tax collector, to get the taxes from there. The Turks didn't go to places that didn't have strategic importance for them. The Ottomans, in this case, didn't have that. Don't forget that within the map that I showed you of the Ottoman Empire, Greece was a very small area of the whole place. Don't forget that at the moment of the revolution, Turkey had serious problems with Persia on the other side. And you had the internal rebellion of the Yenissaries, the Yenissari. And they all sort of all of this sort of a kind of, if I may say, internal unrest, which went through the Sultan himself experience, as you remember. It's like the same thing that happened in Russia with Tsar Alexander and these kind of things. The other monarchs in Europe, especially the Austro-Hungarians in that period. But then, as you see, I believe that's a very interesting sort of a kind of, if I may say, sort of a question. But they didn't want to go there. There was no reason for them to go. The areas that the Turks were going, the place where there could be taxed. There would be taxes. For example, my area of Olympia, Ilia, was heavily taxed because it's plain. They could sort of till the land and get a harvest from there. The same happened in other areas that were useful, like Thessaly, as you see, that were very useful for producing wheat and other actually products for the army. But at the moment that all of this came together, as you see in 1821, money was always a place without strong presence. Although, as you remember, some of them paid taxes, a tribute to the Ottomans to leave them free, to leave them independent. But that is another problem, as you see, to discuss about this.
Vrasidas, since we're followed on numerous platforms, we'll take a question from one of our Facebook followers. This is from Catherine Gauci. What's your opinion of George Finlay's book, The History of the Greek Revolution?
Well, Finlay is in love with the Greeks, as you know, right? He loves them there. He has he criticizes them, but as you see also, but I think the book itself is a product of an era, right? He was contemporary and then published again in 1860, 1861, translated to Greek later on. So I think it's most important the changes of the readers around the book and less about the revolution. I strongly recommend, as I said many times, the most important thing that the dictatorship did of Papadopoulos did for the Greeks is that in 1971 published the collective memoirs of all fighters of the revolution, small or great, big or totally forgotten today. So take it in consideration. If you find all these incredible series that were published by the Greek, state in 1971, it's about 50 to 55 volumes. You need to read, for example, the memoirs of Kanelos Veligiannis, the first Proochontas, the most important leader of the Greeks in Peloponneso. The memoirs of Yenitsaras, what was said later on, of reminiscences and recollections from other people as well in that period. This is an amazingly monumental work which you have to read. I strongly, if I say Finlay was always a an outsider coming into Greece. So I believe the most important thing is to read texts of the people that lived in that incident, and they expressed their experience as they lived it back then.
A question from Elias Yakovleanos. Did the Greek Revolution take place? Meaning, did it achieve the objective of those people who started it and took part in it? What does it say about the Greek state nation society today?
Well, a very important question, but we cannot answer it with yes or no. I always believe that the revolution was yes and no, achieved and failed. We have to see that always in history, there's ambiguity, right? There's no black and white. We can't see that they failed completely. We can't see that succeeded completely. But Mr. Diakolabrinos, do you know many revolutions that were successful? Think of the Russian Revolution. Think of the French Revolution, of the Russian Revolution, of the Chinese Revolution, of all these things. There were always all these different trends and problems within the revolutionaries themselves. So I believe the revolution happened. It had positive effects and it had negative effects as well. And then finally, I think that the problems that you see in society today, in the Greek society today, I try to give them with two terms. Greeks are very distinct for their philotimo, that is to say, they want to help, they want to be sort of proud and they want to be dignified, but at the same time, they are tormented by misalodoxia, by intolerance of the others, at the same time, of the other Greeks. This, a sort of a dichotomy that we have in the Greek character, right? You are and we are both at the same time. We have a philotimo and yet jealousy. We have this and we have love and hatred at the same time.
Thank you, Vrasidas. We're just going to switch and see if we have any questions from the floor, because we do have quite an audience here. Sava, μπορείς να πας στο μικρόφωνο λιγάκι και να κάνεις την ερώτησή σου? Questions from your good friend Sava. Vrasidas, can you hear his question?
Not really.
Now you can hear me?
Yep.
If we fast forward a few decades, when there was an exchange of population and all the Greeks who were Muslims were expelled from Greece, had they not been expelled from Greece, do you think there would have been a problem in creating a cohesive and Greek identity, or would these Muslim Greeks have been integrated successfully and we would have had a successful hybrid?
Okay, if I can rephrase the question, with the exchange of populations in 1923, if that exchange of populations didn't take place and the Muslims remained in Greece,
the Greek Muslims,
the Greek Muslims,
they were ethnic Greeks.
Yeah, how would Greece have evolved? Would it?
Well, I think you can ask the Consul General for this. Actually, the Greeks would have dealt with them, not me. I think for.
Did they pose such a threat?
You're frozen again, Vrasidas. Yes, this is.
Am I there?
Were the ethnic Greek Muslims considered such a big threat to the cohesion and the creativity of a Greek identity that they had to be expelled? What was the problem? What was the fear? Was it so big?
Well, now I don't agree. It's another important question there. But I think that was a huge dilemma back then, right? What constitutes an identity, the Greek identity? And despite the fact that we had civil identities, we believe that religion became the most important differentiating characteristic. Hence, you had, if I may say, many people of Christian faith who came to Greece. One of them was Karamanlis in this case, all right? You know, the Karamanlides. So we have all these strange, sort of, if I may say, sort of a gray areas of identity. But if I may finish with this, Greeks have many identities. We are people of multiple identities. They're not singular, one cohesive identity. We have many, many things. We have regular regional identities. We have national identities. We have social identities. We have sexual identities, religious identities. And not all Greeks are Christians, as you know, right? There are many important Catholic population. There are many important Jews in the country, all right? You can't understand the fight against the Germans in the Second World War without the Greek Jews in the Greek army in this country. And there were only 30 years in the Greek territory by then, right? So the Jews from Thessalonica, I mean, in particular. So I think that we have multiple identities. I think it was up to the Greek state to see if there is a place for Muslim Greeks. I think there is always, because a place for more to essentially expand the definition of Greekness, and but may I call it, my term is not Greekness, it's Hellenicity, to bring the Hellenicity, the Hellenic thing to other people as well. So I don't think that would be a problem, but this is how it was chosen back then. And unfortunately, this choice was taken under the very heavy shadow of the Asia Minor catastrophe.
I think we're going to have to bring so many proceedings to close because it's almost 20 to 9, and I think we could easily be here till midnight. And I think we've tied Professor Karalis.
No, I am on Berocca.
I keep it. Can you take a few more questions?
Yeah, well, Alexandros Messinis has a very nice question here.
Okay,
you know,
we'll take 2 final questions, and Manny and Alexandros, and we'll continue there. If I just may read Alexandros' question. How do you think the modern Greece would look like had the revolution failed? As some people believe that Greece shouldn't have rebelled.
Well, that's a very interesting question, because there are many historians, especially, believe it or not, from the Orthodox perspective, from the Christian Orthodox perspective, who never believed that we should have had this revolution, because the revolution itself, as I said, first of all, it was fragmented the Orthodox Church, especially the Patriarchate of Constantinople, created national religions, ethnophiletismos, as they call it. And then, as you see, there's the other idea that gradually the Ottoman Empire was falling into the hands of the Greeks. Why did that revolution happen then? The same reservations were expressed by Karalis. Karalis said, what are you doing? When the revolution broke out, he said, it's not time, it's immature, it's premature to do this revolution at the moment. But it happened. So I think that if the revolution had failed, can I say that can be a prophet of doom and gloom? There were no Greeks left.
Okay, one final question from Manny. Yes, go to the microphone, please, Manny.
The celebrations that we're having this year, in the context of the rise of the right or fascism in Europe, what danger does that present, that the celebrations become nationalistic and not something deeper?
Well, thank you for the question, but that's why I insisted that the revolution was not simply about nationalistic. It was about, if I may draw a distinction, it's about ethnicity, not about nationalism, all right? It was about ethnic affirmation, that we actually do it today as well. So unfortunately, as you see, these things are always appropriated by the wrong people, but that's why we have these lectures to talk about critical knowledge of the past. That's why I insisted the diversity of opinion, approach, of ideas, practices that all the revolutionists have. And yet they found a solution. They found a way of communicating and understanding each other. This is what we have to do. You have to understand, we have to understand that we are, in our difference is our strength. And this is what the Greeks understood, you know, just in antiquity, in that period. That's why I strongly recommend, read the first constitution of the Greek Revolution. It is an amazing text, which was so progressive that it could never be implemented.
And συγγνώμη, Γιάννη, μια στο μικρόφωνο παρακαλώ. Έχουν πάρει φόρα τώρα.
Και μία στα ελληνικά τώρα. Και μία στα ελληνικά. Ναι, ναι. All right, that's all right.
Thank you very much for your presentation once again. As a Greek historian, and while we are celebrating the 200 years of our independence, what emotions do you experience when you hear about Turkey's daily provocations against Greece and that they are going to send 87 warships into the Aegean Sea? Who is to blame? The Greek historians, the Greek politicians, the Greeks all together?
Βρασίδα.
Πω, είστε φωτιά. Φωτιά και λαύρα. Φωτιά και λαύρα. I think that the worst thing to do is start blaming ourselves. The only thing that we can do at the moment be united, because there is an explicit and visible threat. And the threat is not us, is Erdogan. And the policy that he actually has given to the new direction policy that he has given to the Turkish state. Can you hear me?
Μια χαρά.
All right. So I don't believe that we have to blame ourselves. I never blame, just under all circumstances, you have to sit down with another Greek and try to find a common solution and a common activity. At the moment, we are under what they call the low warfare at the moment by the Turkish state. And I think that we have to reorganize ourselves, get our act together, and try to find a solution with our own power or strength, with our own, to become self-sufficient, and then finally, do stop undermining each other. The most important thing, and όπως το έλεγε ο Σολομός, αν παλεύουν μαζί τους, δεν τους πρέπει η ελευθερία. This is the secret of the whole thing. I believe that I feel very uncomfortable, to be honest, with what happens there. And I have to tell you, I did, sort of I felt uncomfortable with Hagia Sophia as well, to be honest.
I feel very furious, or not only uncomfortable.
Χρήστο, έχεις με τελευταία ερώτηση. Και τελειώνουμε τώρα με μια τελευταία ερώτηση από τον Χρήστο Φίφη.
Ευχαριστώ. Ναι.
Congratulations, Vrasidas, for your analysis. Coming back to the revolution, the Greek Revolution changed, we must say that it changed the Greek society. Various groups probably contributed to the constitution, the Epidavros constitution, which was more democratic, we might say, than the 1843 and the 1864 constitutions. I don't talk about 1911, but obviously it was more democratic than those two subsequent constitutions. What role did every group play for that for the Epidavros constitution, like the Koutsabashis, like the army, like the clergy, like the sea people?
Well, as you said, and we said before, the idea is that the constitution is a product of, essentially, if I may say, compromise by all sides of this. They all had something to contribute, and that's why I call it a palimpsest and a palimpsisto of political ideas, the one over the other. That's why it's so interesting and so unenforceable as well. You can't implement this, and that's why the second constitution of Trizina tried to improve on this, to make it more practically feasible. And more later on, the other constitutions of the revolution. The constitution of 1844 is a political constitution, right? It presupposes there is a state. The constitution of Epidavros presupposes there is no state. You make the state at the moment. There is no state bureaucracy, there's no army, there's nothing in 1821. In 1844, we already have a form of this, all right? We have a bureaucracy, we have a king, we have a big educational system, there is a currency going on, there is an economy as well, developing. So there are different circumstances, I think, but I believe that the first constitution represented all these different factions and different groups and different interest groups, if I may use the term, or focus groups, if I may say, to call them today. And it was a compromise for all of them. It was what we call today a vision statement, more than a practical document of prescriptive politics. How we would like the society to be, not how the society is, because there was no society in that. Δεν ξέρω αν απάντησα, Χρήστο, αλλά είναι μεγάλο τώρα.
Μεγάλο θέμα. Okay, all that remains for us to thank Vrasidas. A big round of applause for our speaker tonight, Vrasidas Karalis.
Ευχαριστώ πολύ.
We will have him back in the flesh on the 22nd of April, but we haven't announced that event yet. We hope to have him back at some stage in April. Thanks for coming. We'd like to see you next week at where Dr. Eleftheria Zey will be speaking on Mando Mavrogenos. So see you all again next week. Thanks for participating in this seminar tonight. Vrasidas, χίλια ευχαριστώ, όπως πάντα.
Γεια σας, ναι. Melbourne, βάστα κατακαημένη Μελβούρνη. Ναι. Γεια σας, καληνύχτα. Πώς βγαίνω?